The bullet that killed Clara Havens' husband passed clean through him on a Tuesday morning in April of 1882, and by Thursday she was alone on 40 acres of sun-cracked Texas soil with a broken wagon wheel, 3 laying hens, and a debt to the Harlow Land Company that felt heavier than the sky pressing down on the flat horizon. She did not scream when it happened. She did not faint. She stood at the edge of the corral with her hands pressed flat against the rough wood of the fence post, and she watched the sheriff's deputy write something in a small leather-bound book, and she thought, with a strange and terrible clarity, that the morning glories she had planted along the south fence were just beginning to bloom. His name had been Thomas Havens, and he had been 26 years old, and he had loved her in the uncomplicated way that some men love, without poetry or grand gesture, but with a steadiness that she had come to rely on the way one relies on the presence of a particular star in a particular place in the sky. And then he was gone. Shot by a man named Deke Harlow over a property dispute that Thomas had believed could be resolved with reasonable conversation, which had been his greatest and most fatal miscalculation. Deke Harlow was the son of Gerald Harlow, who owned the Harlow Land Company, which had been steadily buying up parcels of the Panhandle for 3 years. Gerald Harlow wanted the Havens property because the creek that cut through the northeast corner of it was one of the few reliable water sources for 15 miles, and water in that part of Texas in 1882 was worth more than gold and considerably more than one man's life. The sheriff, a thin man named Aldous Briggs who had a habit of studying his own boots during difficult conversations, had ruled the shooting self-defense. Thomas had raised his voice. Deke had drawn his pistol. That was all the law needed to hear. Clara had buried her husband herself, with help from their nearest neighbor, a Mexican woman named Senora Reyes who lived 4 miles east, and who had brought tamales and stayed for 2 days without being asked, which was the kindest thing anyone had ever done for Clara in her life. When Senora Reyes finally left, driving her mule cart back through the mesquite scrub, Clara had stood on the porch of the small adobe house she and Thomas had built the previous spring, and felt the silence of the land wrap around her like something cold and permanent. She was 23 years old. She had grown up in Georgia, the daughter of a schoolteacher, and she had come west 2 years earlier as a bride, full of the romantic notion that the frontier was a place where a person could build something entirely their own. She had not imagined the particular quality of West Texas loneliness, the way it came at you not just from the empty miles but from the sky itself, which was so enormous and so indifferent that standing beneath it on a bad day felt like being erased. She set about surviving. She repaired the wagon wheel herself, using a technique Thomas had shown her once in the patient, thorough way he explained everything. She drove to the town of Cutter Creek, which was 11 miles northwest, and she sold 2 of the laying hens to pay for flour and salt and coffee. She kept the 3rd hen because she needed the eggs. She planted what she could in the kitchen garden. She fixed the leaking section of the roof by herself, balancing on the edge with a bucket of pitch and a determination that scared her slightly, because she was not naturally fearless but had simply run out of alternatives to courage. It was in the middle of all this surviving that the man appeared. She was pulling water from the well on a warm morning in early May when she heard hoofbeats on the dry track that served as her road. She straightened and shielded her eyes against the slanted morning light and saw a single rider coming from the west, moving at an easy pace on a big bay horse. The rider wore a dark brown hat that was weathered to the color of old wood and a gray shirt and boots that had seen a considerable amount of hard country. He pulled his horse to a stop at the edge of her yard and looked down at her from beneath the brim of his hat. "Morning," he said. "I am looking for the Havens property. Would this be it?" "It would," Clara said. "Thomas Havens is dead. I am his widow. Whatever business you have with the property, you have with me." She said it plainly, the way she had learned to say difficult things, without apology or hesitation, because she had found that men in this part of the world respected plainness and mistook hesitation for weakness. The writer studied her for a moment. He had a lean, angular face, brown from the sun, with dark eyes that were steady in their regard without being unkind. She put his age somewhere around 28 or 30. "My name is Callum Reid," he said. "I knew Thomas Havens from Abilene a few years back. I heard about what happened. I am sorry for your loss, Mrs. Havens. I was passing through the territory and I thought I would stop and see if there was anything useful I could do." Clara looked at him with the careful assessment she had developed over the past several weeks. She had learned to read men quickly since Thomas died because men had been coming around with various purposes, some honest and some considerably less so. Deke Harlow had sent his foreman twice with offers to purchase the property, offers Clara had refused both times with a curtness that had apparently surprised them. Callum Reid sat easy in his saddle and he did not fidget under her scrutiny. That was something in his favor. "Did Thomas owe you money?" she asked. "No, ma'am." "Do you want to buy this property?" "No, ma'am." "Then what exactly are you offering?" He took his hat off and held it against his knee in a gesture of sincerity that struck her as genuine rather than performed. His hair was dark and a little long, and there was a scar above his left eyebrow that had the silvery look of something old. "A few days of work," he said. "Whatever needs doing. I can see from here that your corral gate is hanging wrong. Your well casing looks like it needs shoring up. I notice you are hauling water alone, which is hard work. I have no particular place to be this week, and I know how to fix things." "Men who fix things for widows generally want something in return," Clara said. "I expect that is true of some men," he said. "It is not true of me, but I cannot prove that to you standing here. I can only offer my word." She studied him for another long moment. Then she looked at the corral gate, which had been bothering her for 3 days because it was hanging at an angle that meant the bottom rail dragged badly when she tried to open it. Then she looked at the well casing, which was indeed showing signs that it needed attention. "There is a lean-to at the back of the barn," she said. "You can sleep there if you are going to work. I will feed you 2 meals a day. That is what I can offer." "That is more than fair," he said. He dismounted and led his horse toward the corral with a natural economy of movement that she noticed without quite meaning to. He had the deliberate, unhurried quality of a man who had spent a great deal of time alone and had made his peace with it. He fixed the corral gate that afternoon, completely and properly, rehanging it on new posts that he cut himself from timber in the barn. He worked without talking, which she appreciated, and without showing off, which she appreciated even more. When she brought him water at midday, he drank it without fuss and said thank you and went back to work. By evening, he had also patched a section of the corral fence that she had not mentioned to him, but that had clearly been on the verge of failing. And he had cleaned and oiled the hinges on the barn door so they stopped shrieking every time she opened them, a sound that had been wearing on her nerves for 2 weeks. She made cornbread and beans for supper and set a plate on the porch for him. He sat on the step and ate with his hat on his knee, and they watched the enormous West Texas sunset spread itself across the sky in shades of orange and deep violet. "How did you know Thomas?" she asked. "We worked the same cattle drive out of Abilene in '79, he said. "He was a good man to work with, steady, never complained, good sense of humor once you got to know him." "Yes," Clara said, "that sounds like him." They sat in silence for a while, which did not feel uncomfortable. "What are you going to do about the Harlow situation?" he asked. She looked at him. "What do you know about the Harlow situation?" "I passed through Cutter Creek before I came here. People talk. It sounds like Gerald Harlow wants this property and his son killed your husband over it, and the law sided with the Harlows, which is how these things tend to go when one man has money and the other does not." "That is a fairly accurate summary," Clara said. "And what is your plan?" "To stay," she said. "To not give them an inch. This is my land. It is in my husband's name, which legally transfers to me, which I have already confirmed with a lawyer in Cutter Creek. Gerald Harlow can make offers until he goes blue in the face. I will not sell." Callum Reid was quiet for a moment. Then he said, That takes a kind of courage that not everyone has. It is not courage exactly, Clara said. It is stubbornness. My mother always said it was my worst quality. He smiled at that. It was a small smile, quick and genuine, and it changed his face in a way she noticed. He stayed 3 days as he had said he would. During those 3 days he fixed the well casing, repaired a section of the roof she had missed, built a proper latching system for the henhouse door so the single remaining hen would be safe from coyotes at night, and reset 2 fence posts on the south boundary that had worked loose from the ground. He was quiet and competent and respectful, and he did not look at her in the way that some of the men who had come around recently had looked at her, with a kind of calculating appraisal that made her feel reduced to an asset. He looked at her the way one person looks at another person, with simple, direct attention. On the 3rd evening, as the light was going gold across the flat land, she poured 2 cups of coffee and brought them out to the porch, and he accepted his with a quiet thank you, and they sat the way they had been sitting in the evenings, watching the country settle into dusk. "You do not have to go tomorrow," she said. It was not an invitation of the romantic kind. She said it with the same plainness with which she said everything. "There is still the east fence line, and the water trough in the corral is cracked. I can pay you in room and board." He looked at the horizon for a moment. "All right," he said. He did not say it eagerly, which she respected. He said it the way a sensible person agrees to a sensible arrangement. He stayed another week. The east fence line took 2 days because it turned out to be in worse shape than either of them had realized, with posts rotted at the base and wire that had stretched and sagged over a long stretch. They worked on it together because 2 people could handle the wire better than one, and Clara discovered that she was not bad at this kind of work, which she had not known because Thomas had generally done the heavy fencing without expecting her help. Callum worked beside her without comment on the fact that she was a woman pulling wire on a fence line, which struck her as the correct response. On the 2nd day of fencing work, she told him about Georgia, about her father the schoolteacher and the small town she had grown up in, and about the particular sequence of circumstances that had brought her west with Thomas. She was not sure why she told him. She had not told anyone else, not even Senora Reyes. She supposed it was because he listened the way some people listen, with his whole attention, without preparing his response while she was still talking. He did not tell her much about himself. Not from secrecy, she sensed, but from the habit of privacy that the open country tended to develop in people who spent enough time in it. She learned that he was from Colorado originally, that he had worked cattle for most of his adult life, that he had no family he was in regular contact with, and that he was on his way generally south toward the border for reasons he did not specify. She did not push. When the fencing was done and the water trough was repaired, he painted the barn door, because he had found a tin of red paint in the barn, and it seemed a shame to waste it, and she agreed. 3 weeks after he arrived, she woke one morning to the sound of him already at work in the yard, and she lay in the narrow bed she had been sleeping in alone for 6 weeks and listened to the sound of hammer on wood and felt something move in her chest that was not grief for the first time since Thomas died. It was not happiness exactly. It was something quieter and more tentative than that. It was the simple, startling realization that she was glad the sound was there. She got up and made coffee and stood at the kitchen window, watching him work on the porch step that had been soft in the middle since February. He worked with his hat pushed back on his head and his sleeves rolled up, and the morning light was long and golden across the yard, and the single hen was pecking around his boots with the hopeful stupidity that characterizes hens, and the scene had a completeness to it that made her throat ache. She brought him coffee. He accepted it. They stood on the repaired step and drank in the morning together, and she thought that this was the most ordinary and the most complicated moment she had experienced in a very long time. That evening after supper, she sat on the porch with her mending, and he sat with a piece of wood he was whittling into something that was not yet recognizable, and the silence between them had changed slightly without her being able to say exactly how. It was warmer than it had been in the first days, more comfortable, like furniture that had been arranged and then rearranged slightly into a configuration that worked better. "It has been 3 weeks," she said. He looked up from his whittling. "Has it?" "It has." She kept her eyes on her mending. "I am not complaining. You have been more useful than I have any right to expect. I am simply noting it." "Is that your way of asking me to leave?" he said. She set down her mending and looked at him directly. "No," she said. "It is my way of acknowledging that you are still here, which I did not expect, and trying to understand why." He was quiet for a moment. He set down the piece of wood and the small knife he had been using, and he looked at her with those steady dark eyes that she had been learning to read over the past 3 weeks and had not yet entirely succeeded. "Mrs. Havens," he said. "Clara." It was the first time he had used her given name, and the sound of it in his voice did something to the air between them. "I am still here because I want to be. Because this place needs tending and you are doing it mostly alone, and that seems wrong, and because—" he stopped. "Go on," she said. "Because I find that I do not want to leave," he said simply. She looked at him for a long moment. The last of the daylight was behind him and his face was in the shadow of his hat brim. "That is an honest answer," she said. "It is the only kind I know how to give," he said. She picked up her mending again. He picked up his whittling. The night came on around them soft and full of cricket sound, and neither of them said anything more, but the silence had changed again, had taken on a quality that was almost like warmth, like the memory of warmth, like the possibility of it. The trouble with Gerald Harlow arrived, as trouble usually did, on a clear day when everything else seemed fine. Clara was in the kitchen garden when she heard the horses, more than one this time, moving fast down the track. She straightened and wiped her hands on her apron and walked around to the front of the house. 3 riders were coming in, Deke Harlow in the front with his foreman riding to his right and a third man she did not recognize. They pulled up hard in the yard, and Deke Harlow looked down at her from his horse with the expression of a man who has never in his life been required to consider what other people feel. Deke Harlow was 25, handsome in a florid and slightly bloated way, with a thick blonde mustache and pale blue eyes that had the flat quality of a clear sky with nothing behind it. He wore good clothes and a quality gun belt, and he had the posture of a man who had always had money and had been allowed to confuse money with virtue. "Mrs. Havens," he said, "my father has authorized me to increase the offer to $800. That is more than a fair price for this property, and we would like to conclude this matter." "The answer is still no," Clara said. Deke's expression did not change much, but the quality of his stillness shifted. "I think you may not appreciate the difficulty of your situation," he said. "A widow, alone out here with a broken-down spread and a debt to the land office. $800 could give you a fresh start somewhere more suitable." "More suitable for whom?" Clara said. Before Deke could answer, Callum came around the side of the barn. He walked without hurry, pulling on his gloves, and stopped about 10 feet from Clara's right shoulder. He did not do anything aggressive. He simply stood there, which in itself communicated something fairly clear. Deke looked at Callum. "Who are you?" "My name is Callum Reid," Callum said. "I am working this property." Deke's pale eyes moved between Callum and Clara with a knowing smirk that Clara found both insulting and tiresome. "Is that what they are calling it?" Deke said. "You will speak to Mrs. Havens with respect," Callum said, in the same easy tone he used for everything, but with something beneath it like stone. Deke studied him for a moment with the assessment of a man who has hired violence often enough to know what it looks like when it is contained. Callum was not large in a showy way, but there was something in the way he stood, balanced and unhurried, that gave even Deke Harlow a moment of calculation. "This property will belong to the Harlow Land Company," Deke said, returning his attention to Clara. "One way or another, I am trying to make the transition easy for you, Mrs. Havens. My father is not a patient man." "Neither am I," Clara said. "Good day, Mr. Harlow." Deke held his position for a beat longer than was comfortable and then wheeled his horse and rode out with his 2 men behind him. raising a little cloud of pale dust that drifted slowly east in the still air. Clara stood and watched until they were out of sight. Her hands were steady, which surprised her slightly because her heart was moving very fast. "He is going to try something more serious," Callum said, not as a prediction so much as a statement of fact. "I know," Clara said. "What do you want to do?" She turned and looked at him. "I want to write to the land office in Austin and make absolutely certain my ownership of this property is recorded and unambiguous. I want to speak again to the lawyer in Cutter Creek. And I want to fix the south fence before it gives way entirely, because that problem does not care about the Harlows." The corner of his mouth moved. "All right," he said. "I will start on the south fence." She went inside and sat at the small desk by the window and wrote 2 letters, one to the land office and one to the lawyer in Cutter Creek, whose name was Henry Pratt, and who had been the one to confirm her legal ownership of the property in the first place. She wrote both letters with careful precision, the way her schoolteacher father had taught her to write, clearly and without unnecessary flourish, and then she read them over twice and sealed them. She drove to Cutter Creek the next morning to post the letters. Callum came with her, riding the bay alongside the wagon, and she did not ask him to, but she did not tell him not to. Cutter Creek was a town of perhaps 400 people, with a main street of packed dirt and about a dozen buildings of varying permanence. There was a general store run by a man named Floyd Archer and his wife, a saloon called the Dusty Boot, a small church, a sheriff's office, and the legal practice of Henry Pratt, which occupied a narrow building between the post office and a hardware merchant. Clara went to the post office first, then to Henry Pratt's office. Pratt was a thin, precise man of about 50 with spectacles and a dry manner that she found reassuring, because it suggested he dealt in facts rather than sentiment. "The letters are a sound precaution," Pratt told her after she explained the situation. "Your deed is properly recorded. Harlow cannot buy what you will not sell." However, he paused in the way of a man who was about to say something difficult. "A man like Gerald Harlow has other methods available to him when direct purchase fails. He has influence with Sheriff Briggs, as you are aware. I would advise you to document any harassment or intimidation carefully. Dates, times, what was said. It may matter if this goes to a court. Is there any court in this territory that Gerald Harlow does not have influence with?" Clara asked. Pratt was quiet for a moment. "There are federal judges," he said carefully, "who are less susceptible to local influence." Clara noted this. "Thank you, Mr. Pratt." When she came out of Pratt's office, Callum was leaning against the post beside the hitching rail, hat tipped back, watching the street with the comfortable patience of a man who can wait without fidgeting. He had been talking to Floyd Archer, she supposed, because he sometimes went into the general store for tobacco, which he smoked in a pipe in the evenings on the porch. Beside Pratt's building, a man she did not know was sitting on a barrel watching her, with a kind of specific attention that was slightly different from ordinary curiosity. When she caught his eye, he looked away, a beat too slow to be natural. She told Callum about it when they were out on the road heading home, the wagon rocking gently over the ruts. "Harlow man, most likely," Callum said. "He will want to know what you are doing in town, what Pratt said to you." "He cannot know what Pratt said to me," Clara said. "No, but he can know that you went to Pratt, which tells Harlow you are not backing down, which Harlow probably already suspected." "Do you know much about men like Gerald Harlow?" Clara asked. "I know the type," Callum said. He was quiet for a moment. "Men who have got what they wanted through money and pressure for long enough stop being able to imagine a situation in which that stops working. He genuinely believes you will eventually give in, that you have to." "And does that make him more dangerous or less dangerous?" Clara asked. Callum thought about it. "More," he said. "Because when it becomes clear you will not give in, he will have to revise his understanding of the world, and men like that do not revise well." She drove in silence for a moment, watching the ears of the wagon horse flick back and forth. "Callum," she said. His name in her mouth had become natural, she noticed, without her having made a conscious decision about it. "Are you worried about what he might do?" "I am paying attention to what he might do," Callum said. which is not quite the same as worried but in the same neighborhood. She glanced at him sideways. He was watching the road ahead, one hand resting easy on his thigh, the other loose on the reins of the bay. "You should not feel obligated to stay because of this situation," she said. "The Harlows are my problem." He looked at her then directly, in the particular way he had that she had learned to recognize as meaning he was about to say something precise. "Clara," he said, "I'm not staying out of obligation." She looked back at the road. Her heart was doing something she had not asked it to do, which was becoming a pattern when Callum Reid said certain things in a certain tone. "What are you staying out of?" she asked, keeping her voice steady. He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "The truth is I have been asking myself the same question, and the answer I keep arriving at is that I want to be here, this particular place, with you." He paused. "If that is something that troubles you, I can find another arrangement." She did not answer immediately. She let the wagon roll on for a quarter-mile, and she thought about Thomas and about grief, and about the way life insists on continuing regardless of what you have lost. She thought about the sound of Callum's hammer in the morning and the way he listened to her when she talked and the small smile that came and went quickly and was more valuable for its rarity. "It does not trouble me," she said. "It is unexpected, but it does not trouble me." He said nothing more. But he moved the bay slightly closer to the wagon for the remainder of the drive home, and she did not remark on it, and neither did he. The nights in West Texas in May were cool after the day's heat had burned off, and the sky was something that had to be experienced to be understood. No painting had ever done it justice, and no description was adequate. It was simply enormous. The sky, dense with stars in a way that the eastern sky never was, because out here there was nothing between you and the full depth of the universe except a thin layer of clear air, and on good nights you could feel the immensity of it pressing gently down. Clara had begun to appreciate the sky in a way she had not when Thomas was alive, which she thought was because grief had a way of making the world both smaller and larger at the same time. You lost one person and the personal world contracted terribly, but the impersonal world, the sky and the land and the long distances, expanded to fill the space, and sometimes that was unbearable and sometimes it was oddly comforting. She mentioned this to Callum one evening when they were sitting on the porch after supper, the stars beginning to appear one by one in the deep blue overhead. "I used to think the sky out here was oppressive," she said. "All that space. Like it was trying to make you feel small. And now," he said, "now I think it is honest," she said. "You are small. Acknowledging it is better than pretending otherwise." He was quiet for a moment, looking up. "My father used to say that," he said. It was more personal than he usually offered, and she felt the weight of it. "Your father was a wise man," she said. "In some respects," Callum said. "Not all of them, but in that one, yes." She waited to see if he would say more. He did not, and she did not press. They sat in the cooling night and watched the stars multiply overhead. And after a while she realized that she was not sitting as far from him as she had been in the early days, that the distance between them on the porch had compressed gradually over the weeks without either of them making a deliberate decision about it. The way bodies move toward warmth without instruction. "Callum," she said. "Yes." "Why are you still here?" She said it without calculation. She had been thinking about asking it for several days, and it came out simply and directly in the way that her thoughts often came out, without the softening that some people would have applied. He turned his head and looked at her. She was looking at him too, watching his face in the starlight, which was considerable given the density of the sky above them. He looked at her for a long moment. She could see his eyes, dark and clear, and the line of his jaw, and the way his mouth was set in that way it had when he was thinking something through carefully. "You," he said, just that word. One syllable, delivered with a directness and a certainty that made it more meaningful than a much longer speech would have been. He said it the way a man states a fact he has verified many times and is no longer uncertain about. Clara felt the word land in her chest and rearrange something there. She did not look away. She held his gaze in the starlight, and she was quiet for long enough that he would have been justified in worrying about her response, but his expression did not flicker into anxiety. He simply waited, with the patience she had come to understand was his fundamental nature, giving her time to arrive at her own understanding. "That is the most honest thing anyone has ever said to me," she said finally. "I mean it to be," he said. "I know you do," she said. "That is what makes it what it is." The creek frog chorus was beginning somewhere to the northeast, and the cooling air smelled of dry grass and the faint sweetness of the evening primrose that grew in scattered patches near the well. She became aware of how close they were sitting, truly aware of it for the first time in a deliberate way, and she thought about the distance between them and about what it might mean to close it, and about whether she was ready for that kind of meaning. "I am not entirely sure yet how I feel," she said honestly. "About everything. It has only been 2 months since Thomas." "I know it," he said. "I'm not asking you to be sure. I'm only being honest about my own position so that you understand it." "And your position is that you want to stay," she said. "My position is that I would like to stay," he said. "If you will have me, not just as a hand on the property, but as," he paused, choosing, "as something more in whatever way that looks like for you, in whatever time frame that requires." She looked at him for a long moment, and then she looked up at the stars, and then she looked back at him. "All right," she said. "Let us see what it looks like." He nodded, and she thought she could see something in him settle, the way a man settles when something uncertain becomes certain, a slight releasing of something that has been held. They did not kiss that night. They sat on the porch for another hour until the chill drove them inside, and she said good night and he said good night, and they each went where they went, and the house held the night around it in its thick adobe walls, and nothing dramatic occurred. But something had shifted, quietly and completely, and they both knew it. The threat from the Harlows escalated, as Callum had predicted it would. First it was a fence post on the western boundary knocked down, which could have been cattle, but which happened to be on the boundary that the Harlow property shared with the Havens land. Clara and Callum reset the posts. Then a section of the creek bank showed signs of having been blocked upstream, which would have reduced the flow to the Havens property, except Callum found the blockage before it had its full intended effect and cleared it. Then there was the matter of the note, which arrived one morning wrapped around a rock that was thrown through the kitchen window, which made Clara's heart hammer hard, but which she refused to let make her hands shake. The note said in block letters, "Sell or regret it." Clara brought the note to Henry Pratt, who documented it carefully. Callum rode out along the western fence and the creek boundary and came back and said nothing specific, but that evening he cleaned his rifle methodically at the kitchen table, which Clara understood was not aggression but preparation, the same instinct that made her sharpen the kitchen knife and check the latch on the henhouse, the practical response to knowing that the world contains people who wish you harm. "Have you been in trouble before?" she asked him. She was sitting across from him at the kitchen table, mending again, in the pool of lamplight. "Some," he said without looking up from what he was doing. "The kind you brought on yourself or the kind that found you?" "Mostly the kind that found me," he said. "I am not generally a man who goes looking for difficulty, but I have found that some people are drawn to the notion that a man on his own can be pushed around without consequence. They tend to revise that notion eventually." "Were you ever a lawman?" she asked. He looked up at her then. "No," he said. "I have worked cattle most of my life. Before that I did what a young man with no family and no money does, which is whatever work is available. I have been a lot of things. Not always things I am proud of." He held her gaze. "I want you to know that. Not to confess anything specific, but because I think you deserve to know the general character of a man you are allowing to stay on your land." Clara set down her mending. "Callum," she said, "you have spent the better part of a month on this property. I have watched you work. I have watched how you speak to people, how you think through problems, how you treat Senora Reyes when she comes by, and how you are with the horse and the hen. A person can dress themselves up in words, but they cannot dress up their daily behavior. I have seen your daily behavior. I am not worried about your general character." He was quiet for a moment. Something moved across his face that she had not quite seen there before, a kind of vulnerability that was moving specifically because it was so obviously unfamiliar to him. "Thank you," he said, very quietly. She picked up her mending again. "Finish cleaning the rifle," she said, "and then let us figure out a better night watch schedule for the western boundary." He went back to the rifle, but there was a quality of warmth in the room after that which had not quite been there before, and they both felt it, and it made the lamplight seem kinder and the evening more manageable. Senora Reyes came by the following Saturday with her mule cart and two of her grandchildren, a boy and a girl, who ran in the yard and terrified the hen and were entirely good for the general atmosphere of the place. Senora Reyes brought chilies from her garden and sat on the porch with Clara and watched Callum showing the boy how to properly coil a rope. "He is a good man," Senora Reyes said in her straightforward way. "He is," Clara agreed. "It is all right to feel things, Clara," Senora Reyes said, looking at her with the directness of a woman who has lived long enough to find delicacy inefficient. "It does not dishonor Thomas. Thomas was a good man too, and a good man would not want you to be alone." Clara looked at her hands, which were in her lap. "I know that," she said. "It is not guilt exactly. It is more like I am moving in unfamiliar country and I am not sure of the footing." "The footing improves with each step," Senora Reyes said, and patted Clara's hand with her dry, warm one. "That is how footing works." Clara laughed, which startled her slightly because she had not laughed, truly laughed, in a long time, and the sensation of it was unexpectedly good, like rain after a dry spell. Callum looked over from where he was with the boy and the rope. He caught her eye and a slow smile crossed his face. The full version this time, not the quick small one, and she felt it all the way through her. In June the creek rose briefly from upstream rain, and the kitchen garden began producing in earnest, and Clara discovered that the property was actually more alive than she had realized, that underneath the difficulty and the grief and the threat it was a good piece of land with genuine character. She said this to Callum while they were picking the first tomatoes together. "Thomas chose well," Callum said. "He did," Clara said. "He had good judgment about land, about some things." She paused. "He had good judgment about people too, generally." "He must have if he counted you as a friend." Callum looked at her over the tomato plants. "That is a very kind thing to say. It is a logical thing to say," she said. "Those are not always different." On a Thursday evening in the third week of June, Callum came in from the eastern boundary looking dusty and serious and poured himself a cup of water from the pitcher on the table and drank half of it before he spoke. "I spoke with Floyd Archer today," he said. He heard from his cousin in Amarillo that Gerald Harlow has been in contact with a land claims adjuster from Dallas, a man named Beaumont who specializes in finding technical irregularities in property deeds, disputing ownership on technicalities, essentially, and tying things up in legal proceedings that most small landowners cannot afford to fight. Clara sat down in the kitchen chair. She was quiet for a moment, thinking it through. "Write to Pratt tonight," Callum said. "Pratt needs to make sure every piece of the paperwork connected to this deed is absolutely airtight. And it might be worth writing to that federal judge Pratt mentioned, just to establish a record." "This is going to cost money," Clara said. "Some," Callum said. "I have some money saved. I would like to contribute it to the legal costs." Clara looked at him sharply. "Callum, before you refuse," he said, "let me say this. I understand it is not simple to accept help of that kind, and I understand what it might imply about the nature of my interest in this property and in you, and I want to be clear that it implies exactly what you think it does, and I am at peace with that, and I hope you will consider the offer in the spirit in which it is made." She looked at him for a long time. He met her eyes without shifting. "If you are declaring something," she said carefully, "I would prefer you to declare it plainly rather than through the implication of financial assistance." The corner of his mouth moved. "All right," he said. "I am in love with you, Clara Havens. I have been for some time. I believe the money should go toward your legal costs because this land is yours and it is worth defending, and I intend to be here when it is defended because I intend to be here." He paused. "That is as plain as I can make it." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the hen was saying something to the evening in her opinionated way. The last of the daylight was coming through the west window in long, flat bars of gold. Clara put her hands flat on the table and looked at them for a moment and then looked up at him. "I think," she said slowly, "that I am in love with you too. I have been trying to be sensible about it, because it seems very quick and because I am not entirely sure I trust my own judgment in this condition of having been so recently broken open by loss. But I think the truth of it is that I am, and that I have been for some time, and that trying to be sensible about it is somewhat beside the point." He crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and took her hands from the table and held them in both of his, and she stood up, and they were very close, and she looked up at him, and he looked down at her, and he said her name, just her name, Clara, with a softness that was entirely different from any quality she had heard from him before, and she said his name back to him the same way. And then he kissed her, gently and with great deliberateness, and she kissed him back. It was the first time she had been kissed since Thomas, and it was different from Thomas in the way that any two true things are different from each other while still being true, and she felt the difference without guilt and without the need to measure it, just as itself, which was enough, which was more than enough. When they separated, she kept her hands in his and looked at his face, which was changed by the moment in some way she could see clearly. "I am not a patient man in most respects," he said, which was not entirely accurate, and she knew it, because patience was one of his most fundamental qualities. "But I will be whatever kind of patient you need. There is no hurry." "There is some hurry," she said. "Gerald Harlow is sending a man named Beaumont from Dallas." He laughed at that, genuinely, a full laugh that she had not quite heard from him before, and the sound of it filled the kitchen, and it was one of the best sounds she had ever heard in her life. They wrote to Henry Pratt that evening together, Clara composing and Callum making suggestions that she incorporated or argued against depending on the merit, which was a good working method, she thought, for two people who were both accustomed to independent thinking. The letter was thorough and specific. They also wrote a letter to the Federal Land Office in Austin, which Pratt had indicated was the appropriate avenue for establishing a record of harassment. Then Callum made coffee, and Clara found the last of a tin of molasses cookies that Senora Reyes had brought on her last visit, and they sat at the kitchen table and talked for 2 hours about things that had nothing to do with the Harlows, about Colorado in the winter, which Callum described with a precise and unshowy poetry that surprised and pleased her, about her father's schoolroom and the particular smell of chalk and old books, about what they would plant in the autumn, about the questions without clear answers, which they enjoyed debating with a competitive pleasurableness that was new for both of them. At some point she realized it was very late and the lamp was burning low, and she was still entirely interested in what he was saying, and this struck her as one of the most specific and reliable indications of love she could imagine, that the hours passed unnoticed. She said good night. He said good night. He was still sleeping in the lean-to, which she had improved with a proper bunk and a window, and which she was privately beginning to think of as less than ideal given the change in their circumstances, though she was not yet ready to say so. The man named Beaumont arrived in Cutter Creek on a Friday in late June. He was a compact, well-dressed man of about 40 with a briefcase and an air of professional dispassion that Clara recognized immediately as the posture of someone who does troubling things for money and has learned not to be troubled by them. He filed a petition with the county clerk claiming that the original deed on the Havens property had an irregularity in the chain of title that predated Thomas Havens' ownership, specifically in the transfer from the original land grant to the previous owner, a man named Carl Weber, who had sold to Thomas in 1880. Henry Pratt, to his considerable credit, had anticipated this. He had spent the past week since their letter independently reviewing the chain of title and had found the same potential irregularity and had already taken steps to correct it, obtaining a corrective deed from the county surveyor and filing it before Beaumont's petition could gain purchase. When Clara came to his office and Pratt explained this to her, she felt a surge of relief so strong it made her slightly lightheaded. "Beaumont's petition has no basis," Pratt said with dry satisfaction. "The corrective deed addresses the irregularity. I have also filed a formal complaint with the county clerk regarding the pattern of harassment, citing the broken fence, the blocked creek, and the note through the window." "Will any of this matter?" Clara asked, "given the relationship between Sheriff Briggs and the Harlows?" "The county clerk is not Sheriff Briggs," Pratt said. "Her name is Martha Dowd, and she is, in my experience, entirely immune to the Harlow influence because she finds Gerald Harlow personally insufferable, which is a reliable form of judicial neutrality." Clara walked out of Pratt's office into the bright June day feeling for the first time since Thomas died like the ground beneath her feet was genuinely solid. Callum was waiting by the wagon. She told him what Pratt had said. He listened, and then he let out a breath, and then he smiled at her, not the small smile and not even quite the full laugh smile, but something in between that was particular to this moment, a smile that meant something was going right after a long period of things going wrong. "Good," he said. "Good," she agreed. They drove home through the summer afternoon, and the sky was pale blue overhead, and the mesquite was blooming, and the road was not as rutted as it had been because Callum had spent time on it with a mattock in the evenings, working the worst section smooth. The wagon rolled easier for it. When they reached the property, he helped her down from the wagon, which he did not always do, and he held her hand a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and she let him, looking up at him in the clear light. "I want to talk about what happens next," she said, "for us, not just the property." "Then let us talk about it," he said. "Tonight," she said, "after supper." "After supper," he agreed. She made a proper supper that evening, not just the functional meals she usually managed, but something more considered, chicken stew with the vegetables from the garden and cornbread, and the last of a jar of preserved peaches from the supplies Thomas had laid in the previous autumn. She brought out the 2 good plates that she kept for company, which she had not used since Thomas was alive, and she set the table with the cloth that had been her mother's, which she had brought west in her trunk and had not yet taken out. Callum came in from seeing to the horse and stopped in the kitchen doorway for a moment, taking in the table with an expression she could not quite read but which had something in it that made her feel the importance of the gesture had been understood. "You did not have to go to this trouble," he said. "It is not trouble," she said. "Sit down." They ate together in the lamplight, and the food was good, and the conversation was easy in the way their conversations had become easy, flowing between serious and light in the natural way of 2 people who are genuinely interested in each other. She told him about a letter she had received from her mother in Georgia, who was worried about her and had suggested she come home, which was both kind and impossible to consider. "You could not go back," Callum said. "It was not a question." "No," she said. "This is my land, my life. Going back would be a kind of defeat that I could not live with." "I know," he said. "It is one of the things I admire about you most." "What is the list?" she said, partly teasing, partly genuinely curious. He looked at her across the table. "The stubbornness," he said. "The honesty. The way you think through problems practically rather than getting sentimental about them. The way you laugh, which you do not do enough, but when you do it is worth waiting for. The fact that you read to yourself in the evenings and your lips move slightly, which you do not know. The fact that you wrote 2 letters to legal authorities the same evening you found out you were being threatened instead of spending the evening being frightened, though I think you were frightened." "I was frightened," she said. "Writing the letters helped." "I know," he said. "That is the point." She was quiet for a moment. "Callum," she said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to know that the answer, whatever it is, will not change how I feel about you. I'm asking because I need to understand clearly." "Ask," he said. Do you want to stay here permanently, on this land in this life? Not because you feel responsible for me, not out of loyalty to Thomas's memory, but because it is genuinely what you want." He was quiet for a long moment. He looked at his hands on the table, then at her, with that directness that she had come to understand meant he was examining his own honesty before speaking. "I have been moving for most of my life," he said. "Not running from anything specific, but moving because I did not know what I was looking for, and movement seemed like the best way to find it. When I came to this property, I told myself it was for Thomas's sake, to check on his widow and make sure she was all right. And that was part of it. But the truth is I knew within the first week that I had found what I had been moving toward, not the property, not the land, but—" he paused. "This, the specific quality of this life." He held her gaze steadily. "Yes," he said, "I want to stay, permanently, in whatever form we can build that." Clara looked at him for a long moment and then she said, "Then I have a proposition." He waited. "I'm not ready to marry again yet," she said. "Not because of any doubt about you, but because I am still in the middle of something that needs time to complete, and I think rushing it would not be honest to either of us. But I want you here properly, not in the lean-to. I want us to manage this property together as partners, openly, without pretense. And I want, when I am ready and you are still willing, for us to make it formal, for whatever future that includes." He was very still across the table. "Clara Havens," he said, "yes, that is the most unconventional and the most entirely correct proposal I have ever heard." "I am an unconventional woman," she said. "You are," he said. "It is not a complaint." He reached across the table and took her hand, and she turned her hand over and held his, and they sat like that for a while in the lamplight, the kitchen warm around them, the Texas night quiet outside. July and August were hot in the way that West Texas in summer is hot, which is to say uncompromisingly and without apology. The creek level dropped and they were careful with water. The kitchen garden required daily attention. The hen, who had never been given a name because Clara was practical about livestock, continued her opinionated commentary on the world. They worked the property together as partners. Clara managed the accounts and correspondence and the kitchen garden and increasingly the horse, whom she had named Duke, with Callum's approval, because the horse had an air of self-importance that seemed to demand a name of some standing. Callum handled the heavy fence work and the water management and the barn, and they both did everything else as needed, which is the natural arrangement when two people live and work together without artificial divisions of labor. The harassment from the Harlows did not stop immediately, but it changed in character. The physical interference with the fence and the creek stopped, perhaps because Beaumont's legal approach had been the more serious attempt, and its failure had taken some of the confidence out of Gerald Harlow's position. But there were still the looks from Deke Harlow when Clara went to Cutter Creek, still the way certain men in the town aligned themselves with the Harlow interest, still the occasional sense of being watched. Callum managed this with the same competent steadiness with which he managed everything. He did not provoke and he did not retreat. He was in town with Clara when she needed to be in town, without making it conspicuous. He made a point of speaking with Floyd Archer and other townspeople, building the kind of ordinary relationships that gave them roots in the community, which was a form of protection that was more durable than any physical barrier. Sheriff Briggs came out to the property in August with a vague and unconvincing inquiry about a report of stolen cattle, which was clearly a pretext for something, and which Callum handled with such thorough, cooperative unhelpfulness that Briggs left without having accomplished whatever he had come to accomplish. After Briggs left, Clara and Callum stood in the yard watching his dust settle on the road, and then they looked at each other and both laughed, which was satisfying. The formal complaint to the county clerk had had an effect. Martha Dowd was indeed not susceptible to Harlow pressure, and she had passed the record of harassment to a circuit court judge named Palmer who had written to Gerald Harlow directly, which was the kind of official attention that a man like Harlow found deeply uncomfortable. The foreman stopped coming around. Deke, when Clara passed him in Cutter Creek in August, nodded to her with the curt and sullen acknowledgment of a man who has been told by his father that a particular battle is not worth fighting any further. She wrote to her mother in Georgia. She told her about Callum, as honestly as she could in a letter, which was not entirely honest but was honest enough. Her mother wrote back at length, with concerns that were reasonable and warmth that was genuine, and concluded that if Clara was determined to stay in Texas, which she apparently was, she hoped the man was the right kind. "She wants to know if you are the right kind," Clara told Callum, reading from the letter on the porch one evening. "What will you tell her?" he said. Clara folded the letter. "I will tell her you are the best kind," she said, "which is the truth." He looked at her with a warmth that was by now familiar and still powerful. "That is extremely generous," he said. "It is accurate," she said. "Those are not always different." He reached over and tucked a strand of hair back from her face, gently, and she turned slightly into the gesture with the naturalness of something that has become habit. In September, the autumn came, and with it a cooler quality to the air and a change in the light over the flat land. The kitchen garden was put to rest and prepared for the spring planting. Callum spent 2 weeks rebuilding the smokehouse at the back of the barn, which Thomas had started but not finished, and which would be necessary for the winter. Clara worked on the accounts and discovered that the year's finances, while not comfortable, were not as precarious as she had feared in the spring. They had enough to pay the land office fees and Henry Pratt's modest bill, and to lay in supplies for the winter. She wrote a final payment to the land office in October with a sense of satisfaction that felt clean and complete. The Havens property was hers, legally and unambiguously, and the Harlow threat had subsided to the kind of low, simmering ill-will that a man like Gerald Harlow maintained out of pride long after the practical cause was lost. Senora Reyes came for a proper visit in October and sat on the porch in the autumn sun and watched Callum and the boy mending tack in the yard, and looked at Clara with an expression of complete satisfaction. "You look different," she said to Clara. "I expect I do," Clara said. "You look like yourself," Senora Reyes said, "but the full version." Clara considered this. "That is the most accurate description of how I feel," she said. "Thank you." Senora Reyes patted her hand. "Thomas would be glad," she said simply. Clara nodded. She had made her peace with this, quietly and in private, over the months. Thomas was gone, and she missed him in the way you miss a good and gentle thing that is irretrievably lost. But she had come to understand that grief and love are not the same room but adjacent ones, and that you can stand in both without betraying either. On a Sunday afternoon in late October, after Senora Reyes had gone and the day was golden and still, Callum came in from the barn and found Clara standing at the south-facing window looking out at the property with her arms crossed loosely and her expression thoughtful. "What are you thinking about?" he said. She turned and looked at him. He was standing in the kitchen doorway with a quality of golden autumn light behind him, his hat off, his face clean from the well, and she thought that she would like to look at that particular face for the rest of her life, which was a thought she had been preparing to say for several weeks. "I am thinking," she said, "that I am ready." He looked at her. "For the formal version," she said, "of what we already are." He crossed the kitchen and stood in front of her and took her hands. "Are you certain?" he said, and the question was not doubt but care, the same quality he applied to everything important. "I am more certain of this than I have been of anything since I first set eyes on this land and thought that it was worth fighting for," she said. He lifted her hands and pressed them briefly to his lips, an old-fashioned gesture that was somehow entirely right for him, and said, "Then I am the luckiest man in the state of Texas." "You are," she agreed, "and also a very useful one, which I consider an additional recommendation." He laughed fully and warmly, and she laughed with him, and the kitchen was full of it, which was something she had not expected, that a kitchen could be full of something other than function, that it could be full of this. They were married in Cutter Creek in November, in the small church there, by the pastor, whose name was Reverend Albright and who was a large, cheerful man who married people with great enthusiasm and genuine good wishes. Clara wore a dress she had altered from a good blue wool one she had brought from Georgia, and Callum wore the least worn of his shirts and a clean vest and his best hat. Senora Reyes was there with her family, and Floyd Archer and his wife, and Henry Pratt, who shook Callum's hand with surprising warmth and told Clara she had excellent judgment. There was no ceremony about the absence of Clara's family from Georgia. Her mother had written a letter of blessing that Clara carried in her pocket through the whole day, and that was enough. Callum had no family to notify, which was a fact Clara had stopped taking at simple face value, understanding by now that his solitude was not the absence of family so much as the gradual accumulation of a life lived without the foundation of one, which made what they were building together mean something specific and large. After the ceremony, Floyd Archer's wife and Senora Reyes had organized a small celebration in the churchyard, with food that half the town seemed to have contributed, which Clara had not known was coming, and which reduced her, briefly and privately, to the verge of tears that she successfully managed. It was the first time since Thomas's death that the town of Cutter Creek had done something for her that had nothing to do with pity or duty, and the difference was unmistakable. Even Martha Dowd, the county clerk, came and brought a pie. Deke Harlow was not in Cutter Creek that day, which Clara noted and did not lament. The winter settled over West Texas in late November with the particular quality of that region's cold, which was not the deep, wet cold of the east but a dry, cutting cold that came in with a north wind and turned the sky a pale, hard blue. Clara and Callum were prepared for it. The smokehouse was full, and the pantry was stocked, and the barn had been properly chinked against drafts, and the wood supply was adequate. They had moved his belongings from the Linta properly, which had been a simple but significant occasion, and the house felt different now in the way. A house feels different when it is truly inhabited rather than occupied. In the long winter evenings she read aloud to him sometimes, which he liked though he did not say so in so many words. She could tell by the quality of his attention. She had brought 3 books west with her, a collection of Shakespeare, a natural history of North America, and a worn copy of Jane Austen's Emma, which she had read so many times the spine had been repaired with careful stitching. He had opinions about all 3, which surprised her and pleased her, opinions held with the same quiet conviction as all his other opinions, and backed by the independent thinking of a man who had read widely despite having had no formal education, having taught himself largely through the books available in the bunkhouses and ranch offices of whatever spread he had been working. "You should have been a scholar," she told him one evening over the Shakespeare, which they had been discussing with some intensity. "I have been a cowboy," he said without regret. "It is its own education." "It is," she agreed, though considerably harder on the knees. They talked about what they wanted for the property, seriously and at length, over the winter months. Clara wanted to expand the kitchen garden significantly in the spring, and to add a fruit orchard, which Callum thought practical. Callum wanted to build a proper second corral and to acquire 2 more horses so they could work the land more effectively, which Clara thought practical. They both wanted to make a proper study of the water rights connected to the creek, understanding that water was the center of every long-term calculation about this land. They wrote to the Federal Land Office and to a man in Amarillo whom Callum knew to be knowledgeable about water rights in the Panhandle, and they made plans with the careful optimism of people who have learned to be realistic about difficulty, but who choose to look forward anyway because the alternative is no way to live. By February, Clara knew she was expecting a child. She told Callum on a quiet Sunday morning when the winter light was soft through the kitchen window, and the coffee was fresh, and the world outside was still and cold and clear. She told him plainly, as she did everything, sitting across from him at the kitchen table with her hands around her cup. He was very still for a moment. Then he put down his own cup and looked at her with an expression that she had not seen from him before, something open and enormous, something that his habitual composure was not quite able to contain. "Clara," he said. "Yes," she said. "Are you?" he began and then stopped. "Healthy and well," she said. "Senora Reyes is coming next week. She has delivered more babies in this county than anyone. I am not worried." "I am, in fact," she paused, examining her own feelings with the honesty she applied to everything. "Very happy about it." He came around the table and she stood up and he held her carefully but fully with his arms around her and his chin against her hair, and she put her hands flat against his chest and felt his heartbeat, which was faster than usual. "Are you happy?" she said against his shirt. "I do not have a word for what I am," he said. "Happy is too small." "Then we will need a bigger word," she said. He pulled back enough to look at her face. His eyes were bright in the winter light. "I am going to build a proper room onto the east side of the house," he said, "before summer." "That is an excellent response to this news," she said. He kissed her then, with the tenderness that had become the quality she associated most closely with him. A tenderness that was not weakness but its opposite. The tenderness of a person who has enough strength to be gentle. Senora Reyes came the following week as promised, and confirmed what Clara already knew with the calm efficiency of a woman who has assisted at a very large number of births and regards the whole business as one of the more reliably manageable aspects of life. She gave Clara a list of instructions and recommended herbs and a general attitude of sensible activity and adequate rest, and told Callum that he was going to be an excellent father, which she said on the basis of having watched him with her grandchildren, a judgment that Clara found both touching and accurate. Spring came to West Texas the way it always did, with a sweetness that was proportional to the difficulty of the winter, and Clara planted the expanded kitchen garden with Senora Reyes' help and her own increasing comprehension of what grew well in that soil and that light. She planted the beginnings of the orchard, 3 apple trees and 2 peach trees ordered from a nursery in San Antonio and arrived by wagon in good condition, which Callum planted in a row along the south fence with a care that she found affecting. He built the room onto the east side of the house through April, working methodically and well, and she helped where she could and watched where she could not, and by May it was finished, a proper room with a real window and board walls and a plank floor, which was more than she had had in most of the house. The baby arrived in September, a boy, which Clara had thought it would be without being certain why. He arrived with the cooperation of Senora Reyes and the vigorous disapproval of the hen, who spent the relevant hours expressing her opinion loudly outside the kitchen door. He was healthy and emphatic, and had a surprising amount of dark hair in Callum's eyes, which were the last thing Clara saw before she went asleep that first night. Those dark, steady eyes in a very small face looking up at her from the crook of her arm. They named him Thomas, which felt right, and which she had suggested tentatively, and Callum had accepted immediately without discomfort, understanding the significance without needing it explained. Callum held his son for the first time with the same careful deliberateness with which he did everything, sitting in the kitchen chair with the baby in his arms and an expression of concentrated wonder that Clara watched from the bed in the next room and would remember for the rest of her life. "Hello," Callum said, very quietly to the baby. "I have been waiting for you." Thomas Havens Reid was not a simple baby. He had opinions about the world and expressed them with a directness that Clara recognized as familiar. He was also, when content, possessed of a quality of joyful attention to everything around him that was entirely his own and that she fell in love with completely and at once. Senora Reyes said he was going to be a handful. She said it with pride, as though she had had something to do with it. The Harlow problem did not resurface in any serious form. Gerald Harlow died in the winter of 1883 of a heart condition that had apparently been advancing for some time, and Deke Harlow, without his father's money and organizational ability behind him, showed less interest in the Havens property and more interest in a woman in Amarillo who he eventually married, and with whom he moved north. The Harlow Land Company was dissolved. The property claims that Gerald Harlow had been pursuing quietly lapsed without resolution, and the land along the creek remained, as it should have, what it had always been, Clara's. She and Callum stood at the north fence line one evening in the spring of 1884, little Thomas on Callum's hip with the serious interest of a 1-year-old in the long distance, and looked out across the flat country to the horizon. "It is ours," Clara said. "It always was," Callum said. "Yes," she said. "But now it is settled." He looked at her with the full, warm look that she had come to know as the highest form of his affection, the look that held everything he was, the steadiness and the care and the humor and the love that had built itself quietly and surely over the months and years of their life together. Thomas pulled at Callum's hat with the purposeful inefficiency of a baby who wants something and does not yet have the vocabulary to specify it, and Callum let him, and Clara laughed. "He is going to be exactly like you," Callum said, "persistent." "I prefer tenacious," Clara said. "The word does not change the behavior," he said. "It changes the tone of the description," she said. He kissed her then, over the baby's head, in the evening light, with the easy naturalness of two people who have been kissing for long enough that it has become part of the grammar of their daily life, unremarkable in its frequency and entirely remarkable in its meaning. The creek ran clear to the east, catching the last of the light. The orchard trees were beginning to fill out, the apple trees showing the first serious promise of what they would eventually produce. The kitchen garden was going in for the 3rd year, and each year she understood the soil better, and the garden responded to that understanding. The second corral was built, and the 2 horses Callum had wanted were in it, a chestnut mare named Belle, and a smaller dun that Thomas had already begun calling Biscuit with the authority of a child who has no idea that naming livestock implies a certain emotional complication. The lean-to at the back of the barn had been converted to a proper tool room, neat and organized in Callum's systematic way. The house had the room on the east side and a porch that Callum had extended and roofed properly, so they could sit out in the rain if they chose to, which they sometimes did, watching the rare West Texas rain come across the flat land in visible curtains from miles away. Her mother had come to visit in the winter of 1883, making the journey by train to Amarillo and then by hired wagon, a journey that had alarmed Clara enormously, but which her mother had accomplished with the same stubborn equanimity that Clara had apparently inherited. She had stayed for 3 weeks, during which she had watched Callum with the careful assessment of a woman who loves her daughter and is serious about that love. And at the end of 3 weeks she had told Clara privately that she approved without reservation, and that she had not expected the West to be what it was, which was vast and uncomfortable and entirely compelling. Clara had hugged her mother at the Amarillo train station and told her she loved her and watched the train pull away into the enormous Texas sky and felt the comfortable ache of a love that is intact despite distance. Callum was waiting with the wagon. She climbed up onto the seat beside him and he took her hand briefly before picking up the reins. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. They drove home through the winter afternoon, the horses finding their pace on the road they all knew well by now, the flat country unrolling around them in its enormous, honest way, the sky overhead doing what the sky over West Texas always did, which was to be more sky than any reasonable amount of sky needed to be. By 1885 the Havens property, now formally registered under both their names as the Reid property, was one of the more established small spreads in that part of the Panhandle. Not large or wealthy in the Harlow sense, but solid and genuine and productive in the way that things are productive when 2 people work them with genuine commitment and complementary abilities. Clara had begun, in the winter of that year, to teach reading to 3 of Senora Ray's grandchildren who had not yet had access to a school, conducting lessons at the kitchen table on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, with books she had sent away from San Antonio. She discovered that she was good at this in the way her father had been good at it, with the patience for repetition and the ability to make a concept interesting, and the satisfaction of watching a child's understanding shift from confusion to comprehension was one she had not expected to find in that kitchen, but was profoundly grateful for. Callum watched the first lesson from the doorway without her knowing, and when she discovered this afterward, she raised an eyebrow at him. "I was curious," he said. And she said, "You are remarkable," he said simply. She had learned over the years of their life together to accept his compliments without deflecting them, which had taken longer than she would have admitted because her instinct was always to qualify or dismiss. She had learned that his directness deserved an equal response. "Thank you," she said. He smiled. In the spring of 1885, she found out she was expecting again. She told him in the same kitchen, at the same table, with the same honesty. But this time they were different people than they had been the first time. People who had lived through more of the world together and knew each other in the deep, accumulated way of genuine partnership. And the news landed in that deeper knowing and generated a happiness that was richer and more complex than the first time, full of specific anticipation rather than abstract wonder. Thomas, who was 2.5 and increasingly opinionated, was told he was going to have a sibling by both his parents together, sitting in the yard in the spring afternoon. He considered this information seriously for a moment, and then said that he hoped it would like horses, which they both found deeply satisfying. The second child arrived in November of 1885, a girl this time, born on a clear cold morning with Senora Reyes in attendance and Callum in the yard with Thomas, the two of them audible at intervals through the wall, as Callum managed the waiting with the patient steadiness that was his fundamental nature, keeping the boy occupied and calm. She heard Thomas's clear, piping voice ask, "When will Mama be done?" and heard Callum's low voice answer something patient and reassuring, and she thought, in the middle of everything else that was happening, that this was the specific and irreducible thing about him, that he was steady when it counted, that he was there. They named the girl Elizabeth, for Clara's mother, and she arrived with a loud opinion of the world and red in the face with the effort of expressing it, and settled almost immediately when Callum picked her up, which was a fact he was quietly proud of and which he mentioned only once, with the restraint of a man who does not typically boast, but found this too satisfying to leave entirely unspoken. They stood together in the new room that evening, the four of them, Thomas sitting on the edge of the bed beside Clara looking at his sister with the serious concentration of a 2-year-old conducting an assessment, and Callum in the chair beside the bed with the lamp behind him, and outside the window the November night was clear and cold and enormous. "She looks like a potato," Thomas said, with 2-year-old scientific accuracy. "She looks like your sister," Callum said. Thomas considered this as potentially the same thing. Clara laughed, and Elizabeth, as though the sound was familiar already, which of course it was, settled more completely and made a small, satisfied sound. Callum looked across the room at Clara, and she looked back at him, and they held each other's gaze across the lamplight in the particular way of two people who know what they have and know how carefully they came to have it, and both of them were quiet in the fullness of it. The years that followed were not without difficulty. Life on a working property in the Texas Panhandle in the 1880s was never without difficulty. There were dry years and a bad winter in 1887 that tested them both seriously, and a period of low cattle prices that affected the whole region and required careful management of their modest affairs. The apple trees took longer than expected to produce seriously, and the second summer she lost half the kitchen garden to a late frost that she had not anticipated, and which cost them in preserved goods for the winter. But they had built what they had built, and it held through the difficulties the way well-built things hold, not without showing the strain but without failing at the joints. Clara's stubbornness and Callum's steadiness turned out to be an effective combination for exactly this kind of life, which was not surprising once you understood them both. Thomas started school in Cutter Creek at the age of 6, driving in with his parents on the days they went to town, and staying with the Archer family on the other days, an arrangement that Floyd Archer and his wife had proposed with the straightforward generosity that characterized them. He was an intense and curious student who had his mother's appetite for books and his father's capacity for patience, and his teacher sent notes home about him that made both his parents quietly proud in the particular way of people who do not believe in making too much of things. Elizabeth grew into a child who was simultaneously her mother's daughter, direct and practical and not susceptible to nonsense, and also entirely herself, with a quality of warmth and social ease that Clara recognized with some surprise as coming from Callum, from the quality he had that people did not always immediately recognize because of his natural quietness, but which was there underneath it, a genuine warmth and interest in the specific reality of other people. Senora Reyes remained one of the fixed points of their lives. She came and went through the years with the comfortable frequency of family, bringing food and news and her grandchildren, who grew up and began to have children of their own. Clara taught reading in her kitchen through 2 more generations of those children, and to several other children in the surrounding area. And eventually, there was a proper school established in Cutter Creek with a proper teacher, at which point Clara contributed the books she had accumulated and considered the matter successfully handed over. Henry Pratt retired in 1887 and was replaced by a younger lawyer from Lubbock who had grown up on a ranch and who understood property law with the specific comprehension of someone who had been on the receiving end of its consequences. Clara established a cordial working relationship with him as she had with Pratt. Callum's relationship with the land deepened in the way that long-term working relationships do, past the point of professional and into the personal, the way a man understands a piece of ground after years of working it in all seasons, its specific temperament in different conditions, its particular needs and reliable gifts. He had been right years ago that this was good land. The creek was reliable. The soil, properly tended, was productive. The water rights firmly established were a genuine asset in a region where water was the center of every serious calculation. On their 10th anniversary, which fell on a November day that happened to be clear and unusually warm for the season, Clara stood on the extended porch looking south over the property in the afternoon light. The orchard was established and producing seriously now. The trees she and Callum had planted that first spring of their marriage standing in their row along the south fence, with the settled authority of things that have had time to root deeply. The kitchen garden was put to bed for the winter, turned and mulched in the efficient way she had perfected. The 2 corrals were full of horses. The original 2 had become 4, and the barn was in better repair than it had been at any point in its existence. She heard him before she saw him, his footstep on the porch behind her, and she felt him come to stand beside her without looking, knowing the particular quality of his presence the way you know the particular quality of a sound that has been part of your life for so long it has become part of the landscape. He stood beside her, looking south over the property in the afternoon light. 10 years, she said. 10 years, he said. They were quiet for a moment, looking at what they had made together. "Are you happy?" she said. She asked it not because she needed reassurance, but because she had a particular satisfaction in asking him this question periodically and hearing the answer, which was always essentially the same but was delivered each time with a freshness that meant it was genuinely reconsidered. He looked at her. In the 10 years she had known his face, it had changed in the way faces change with time and weather and sun, had deepened and settled into itself, and there was a contentment in it now that had not been there at the beginning, that had arrived gradually and was present in his face the way the roots of the orchard trees were present in the soil, not visible on the surface but fundamental to everything that stood above it. "Clara," he said, "I am more than happy. I am home." She looked back at him and felt something settle in her own chest that had been, in some fundamental way, unsettled since the day she stood at the edge of the corral and watched a deputy write in a leather book. And then before that, possibly since the day she had first stepped off the train in Amarillo and felt the enormous sky press down and thought, with a mixture of terror and exhilaration, that she had committed herself to something vast and uncertain. The vast and uncertain had become this: the property that was hers, legally and lovingly attended to. The children who were running somewhere behind the barn, she could hear Thomas's voice and Elizabeth's reply, and the sound of whatever project they were currently committed to. The orchard in its row, the creek running quiet to the northeast, the hen, who had finally been replaced after a long and opinionated life, by 3 new hens who had not yet developed quite the same character but were working on it, and Callum, who had come down the road one May morning and dismounted in her yard and offered his word and kept it, every day and in every way that mattered, and who was standing beside her now with the long afternoon light on his face and his shoulder warm against hers. "Come on," she said. "Thomas and Elizabeth need to come in for supper, and I have a proposal for the spring." "Another one," he said. It was not a complaint. "The 4th corral," she said. "I have been thinking about the east side of the barn, and I want to talk about a second kitchen garden further south near the orchard." "Then we will talk about it," he said. "Over supper." "Over supper," she agreed. She took his hand, which was brown and work-hardened and familiar, and they turned together from the view and went in, and the porch door closed behind them with the sound of the hinges he had oiled all those years ago, smooth and quiet, still working exactly as they should. Inside, the kitchen filled with the warmth of the stove and the sound of voices and the ordinary miraculous noise of a life that had been built, carefully and stubbornly and lovingly, from the ground up, on good land in West Texas, by 2 people who had found each other by chance and had chosen each other completely, and who woke up every morning and made that choice again. Outside, the evening was coming on and the creek ran clear to the east, and the apple trees stood in their row, and the sky over the Texas panhandle spread itself in the full, enormous, uncompromising way of that sky, vast and honest and blazing with the last of the day's gold light. And on the porch, one of the 3 new hens considered the situation and found it, on the whole, entirely satisfactory.